Picture this. It's the dead of winter in the year 842 after Christ, and somewhere in a Norse coastal settlement, a man is about to change the course of history with nothing more than a dropped tool and desperate circumstances. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Meet Eirik Treeshaper. Now, that's not some nickname given lightly in the Viking world. When they called you Treeshaper, it meant you could take a towering oak and transform it into something that could dance with the waves while carrying 40 bloodthirsty warriors across the North Sea. Eirik had inherited this craft from his father, who had learned it from his father before him, in an unbroken chain stretching back generations. The knowledge lived in his hands, in the way he could read the grain of wood like other men read runes. But tonight, those same skilled hands were trembling, not from the bitter cold that made his breath hang in frozen clouds around the oil lamps, though the winter of 842 was particularly brutal, but from fear, raw, gut-wrenching fear that had been eating at him for weeks. You see, Jarl Hakon Ironside had made Eirik an offer he couldn't refuse, except it wasn't really an offer at all. 5 longships. 5 dragon-headed warships capable of carrying his raiders to new shores rich with silver and slaves, and he wanted them completed before the spring thaw broke the ice on the fjords. 3 months. Maybe less. Now, to understand why this demand was essentially a death sentence, you need to appreciate what went into building a Viking longship using traditional methods. We're not talking about nailing some planks together and calling it a day. Each vessel was a masterwork of engineering that would make modern yacht builders weep with envy. The process began with selecting the perfect trees, oak for strength, pine for flexibility, and then came months of careful seasoning, shaping each plank by hand with tools that hadn't changed since the time of Christ. A single longship, built properly, took 6 months minimum. 6 months of patient work, allowing each strake, that's each overlapping plank in the hull, to properly set in place before adding the next. Rush the process, and you'd end up with a ship that would crack apart in the first real storm, sending your crew to feed the fishes. 5 ships in 6 months? Impossible. 5 ships in 3 months? You might as well ask Eirik to sprout wings and fly to Valhalla. And Jarl Hakon had made the consequences crystal clear. Fail to deliver, and Eirik's family, Eirik's, his wife Ingrid, his daughter Astrid, his young son Magnus, would be declared ***, outcasts stripped of all protection. In the dead of winter, that was a slower but just as certain death sentence as a sword to the neck. So here was Eirik, night after night, working alone in his workshop while his apprentices slept. The traditional methods mocked him with their unhurried pace. 20 days just to properly assemble the hull planking, another 10 to fit the ribs and install the mast. Time he simply didn't have. His grandfather's adze felt heavy in his hands, the same tool that had shaped ships for 3 generations. The weight of family legacy pressed down on him almost as heavily as Jarl Hakon's impossible deadline. Every scrape of the blade against oak reminded him of all the knowledge passed down through the years, all the careful techniques refined over decades. But tradition, for all its wisdom, wasn't going to save his family. It was sometime past midnight when it happened. Eirik was working on a test piece, trying to figure out some way, anyway, to speed up the planking process without compromising the ship's integrity. His hands were numb from cold, despite the small fire he kept burning, and his eyes burned from squinting in the flickering torchlight. That's when he dropped the adze. Now, you might think this is a small thing. Tools get dropped all the time, especially when you're exhausted and working in poor light. But sometimes the smallest accidents reveal the biggest truths. The adze tumbled from Eirik's numb fingers and fell toward the deck, where 2 oak planks lay side by side, waiting to be fitted. Instead of clattering to the ground, the tool wedged itself between the planks at an odd angle. Something about the way it stuck there made Eirik pause. He crouched down, studying the angle, seeing how the blade had found a natural groove between the woods. And that's when it hit him. What if, instead of fitting each plank one at a time, waiting for it to set before adding the next, you could cut angled grooves that would let the planks lock together immediately? Like pieces of a puzzle, each one supporting the others from the moment they were joined. The idea was so radical it was almost heretical. 3 generations of shipwrights had built vessels one careful layer at a time, and here was Eirik contemplating tossing aside centuries of accumulated wisdom. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and Eirik Treeshaper was nothing if not desperate. He spent the rest of that night making calculations, sketching on pieces of bark with charcoal, working out angles and measurements. By dawn, he had the beginnings of what he would later call the clinker lock method, a technique that could reduce hull assembly time from 20 days to 5. But having an idea and proving it works are 2 very different things. Eirik knew he needed to test this revolutionary concept before staking his family's lives on it. So he began work on a small fishing boat, the kind of vessel he could complete in a few days rather than weeks. The first attempts were disasters. Planks split along the grain when he cut the angles too deep. Others refused to fit properly when the grooves were too shallow. But with each failure, Eirik learned something new. He discovered that steam bending the wood first made it more flexible, allowing for tighter joints. He found that certain angles worked better than others, creating locks that actually grew stronger under pressure. Word of his strange new methods reached the ears of Thorvald Slowhand, the settlement's most respected master builder. Thorvald had been shaping ships since before Eirik was born, and he didn't appreciate young craftsmen tampering with time-tested techniques. Madness, Thorvald declared when he saw Eirik's test boat taking shape. You cannot rush what the gods intended to take time. Wood must season, joints must set. This is the way it has always been done. But when dawn broke, on the day Eirik completed his first clinker-lock fishing boat, something unprecedented happened. While Thorvald and his assistants were still preparing their tools and laying out materials for their daily work, Eirik had assembled an entire section of hull planking. The old master stood in stunned silence, watching as Eirik's revolutionary joints held firm under stress testing that would have destroyed traditionally assembled work. The implications were staggering. If this technique could be scaled up to full-sized longships, that's exactly what Jarl Hakon Ironside discovered when he arrived unannounced at the shipyard 3 weeks later, expecting to find Eirik behind schedule and ready to beg for mercy. Instead, he found 5 dragon-headed warships rising from the snow like monsters awakening from winter sleep. 5 ships that shouldn't have existed. 5 ships that changed everything. And as Jarl Hakon ran his hands along hulls that had been assembled in days rather than months, testing joints that felt solid as mountain stone, he realized he wasn't just looking at faster ships. He was looking at the future of Viking power. If you thought Eirik Treeshaper's revolutionary shipbuilding technique would spread peacefully across Scandinavia, well, you clearly don't understand how the Viking world worked. When one Jarl suddenly possessed the ability to build fleets faster than his enemies could count them, every other power in the North Sea took notice. And they wanted that secret. What followed was something unprecedented in medieval Europe, the first industrial espionage war in recorded history. Picture King Horik of Denmark sitting in his great hall in the year 843, just months after word of Eirik's innovation had spread through the network of traders and travellers that connected the Norse world. Horik wasn't just any petty chieftain, Tiistimiva. He ruled the most powerful kingdom in Scandinavia, and he hadn't gotten there by ignoring threats to his supremacy. The reports reaching his court were disturbing. Jarl Hakon Ironside, previously a minor player in regional politics, was suddenly launching raids with fleets that seemed to multiply like rabbits. Ships that should have taken half a year to replace were being rebuilt in weeks. It was as if Hakon had discovered some secret pact with the gods themselves. Horik's solution was elegantly simple and absolutely ruthless. He summoned his most trusted shipwright, a crafty veteran named Gunnar Goldbeard, earned that nickname from the gold wire he wove into his actual beard as a display of wealth, and gave him a mission that would make modern corporate spies proud. Disguise yourself as a merchant, Horik commanded. Learn this secret, and if you cannot learn it, ensure that no one else benefits from it either. Now, Gunnar Goldbeard wasn't just any shipwright. This was a man who had built vessels for 3 different kings and survived the political changes that had killed his predecessors. He understood that in the Norse world, knowledge was power, and power was survival. So in the spring of 843, a well-dressed merchant arrived in Jarl Hakon's territory, claiming to represent Danish silver traders interested in commissioning ships for a major expedition. This merchant spoke knowledgeably about maritime matters, asked intelligent questions about hull design, and paid generously for the privilege of observing the legendary shipyards in operation. Of course, this merchant was Gunnar Goldbeard, and he spent every waking moment studying Eirik's revolutionary techniques. But Eirik Treeshaper hadn't survived this long by being naive. The sudden appearance of curious merchants, the pointed questions about construction methods, the way certain visitors seemed more interested in watching his craftsmen than discussing actual ship purchases. It all felt wrong. The counterintelligence operation that followed would have impressed modern spy agencies. Eirik began teaching false techniques to suspected infiltrators. He had his most trusted apprentices demonstrate deliberately flawed joint-cutting methods, while the real work continued in a hidden section of the workshop. When Gunnar Goldbeard finally returned to Denmark with what he believed were the secrets of clinker lock construction, the ships built using his stolen knowledge cracked apart in their first major storm. But the espionage war was just beginning. Norwegian jarls, not to be outdone by Danish efforts, took a more direct approach. They offered £10 of silver, enough to buy a small farm, to any apprentice who would betray Eirik's methods. When bribery failed, they resorted to kidnapping. Master craftsmen from rival shipyards found themselves seized in midnight raids, tortured for information they didn't possess, then released as warnings to others. The violence escalated in 845, when assassins targeted Eirik's family directly. His daughter Astrid Woodwise, T.R. Mo, named for her uncanny ability to select the perfect timber for any project, discovered armed men surrounding their home one winter evening. But Astrid was her father's daughter. She had memorized every detail of the clinker lock technique, understanding that knowledge was their family's only protection. That night, while Eirik and his son, Magnus, fought off the attackers, Astrid escaped into the darkness carrying nothing but her knowledge and a small bag of silver. She made her way to the coast, found passage on a trading vessel, and sailed for Iceland, one of the few places in the Norse world where blood feuds couldn't easily follow. Her escape proved prophetic. Within months, similar attacks struck shipbuilders across Scandinavia as the secret spread, and various factions tried to control it through violence. The response was something that had never existed before in the maritime world: the secret shipwright guilds bound by blood oaths and protected by hidden symbols. These guilds operated like mystery cults, using coded language and ritual ceremonies to identify genuine members. Master builders would test potential apprentices not just on their woodworking skills, but on their ability to keep secrets under pressure. The guild symbols, a twisted rope overlaying a ship's keel, began appearing carved into workshop beams and tattooed onto craftsmen's arms. But perhaps the most dramatic confrontation of this era was the so-called Battle of the Shipyards in 848. Olaf the Ancient, a master builder who represented the old ways of careful, methodical construction, had watched his traditional workshop lose customer after customer to the new fast-building techniques. His craftsmen faced unemployment, his reputation crumbled, and his very identity as a shipwright seemed under attack. Olaf's response was to gather every traditional builder he could find, nearly 200 craftsmen from across Norway, and march on Eirik's workshop in Trondheim. They came armed with axes and adzes, ready to destroy the tools and materials that threatened their way of life. What they found waiting for them was a lesson in why new technology tends to triumph over old traditions, no matter how cherished those traditions might be. As Olaf's army of traditional builders approached the workshop, Eirik's men calmly launched 3 completed longships from the waterside dock. 3 ships that had been nothing but raw timber just 7 days earlier. The psychological impact was devastating. While Olaf's forces had spent a week marching and organizing their attack, Eirik had built an entire naval squadron. The brief fight that followed was more symbolic than decisive. Some axes were swung, some blood was shed, but the real battle had already been won. You simply cannot fight the future with the tools of the past. By 850, The clinker lock technique had spread throughout Scandinavia, but it hadn't spread uniformly. Regional variations emerged as different kingdoms adapted the method to their specific needs and resources. Danish builders, always focused on military applications, added reinforced keels designed for ramming enemy vessels. Their ships became floating battering rams capable of punching through traditional hulls like spears through shields. Swedish craftsmen, dealing with the extensive river systems of their homeland, developed shallow draft versions that could navigate waterways previously impossible for large vessels. Norwegian shipwrights, facing the brutal storms of the North Atlantic, perfected modifications that made their ships incredibly resistant to the kind of weather that sent other vessels to the bottom. The culmination of this technological revolution came in 865 with the Great Heathen Army's invasion of England. When the Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe a force that seemed to appear from nowhere with over 400 ships, they weren't exaggerating the numbers, they were documenting the first industrial-scale military deployment in medieval history. 400 ships built in 18 months. A fleet that size would have taken traditional methods at least 5 years to construct, assuming you could find enough master craftsmen and raw materials. But with clinker lock construction spreading across every major shipyard in Scandinavia, the impossible had become routine. King Eyel of Northumbria, watching that massive fleet blacken the horizon as it approached the English coast, was witnessing the end of an era. The age when Viking raids were seasonal affairs, limited by how many ships survived the previous year's campaigns, was over. The age of industrial warfare had begun. And it all started with a dropped tool in a desperate shipwright's workshop on a frozen winter night. The period from 860 to 920 after Christ represents what historians call the height of the Viking Age, but that clinical description doesn't capture the reality of what Eirik Treeshaper's innovation had unleashed upon the world. We're talking about an explosion of Norse expansion that makes the Roman conquests look like leisurely walking tours. Think about this. Before the clinker lock revolution, losing 10 ships in a campaign meant waiting an entire generation for replacement vessels. Suddenly, Norse raiders could replace entire fleets within a single season. It was like giving a medieval army the ability to manufacture new swords and armor overnight. The psychological impact alone was staggering. Imagine being a Frankish coastal town, having just fought off a Viking raid at enormous cost, only to see the same dragon-headed ships returning a few weeks later, as if nothing had happened. How do you maintain morale when your enemy seems to possess unlimited resources? Let's follow the story of Bjorn Ironside, Ainside, and yes, that really was his name, earned by surviving a spear thrust that should have killed him, whose Mediterranean expedition between 859 and 862 became legendary precisely because of this new shipbuilding capability. Traditional Viking raids were hit-and-run affairs. Strike fast, grab what you can, and get out before organized resistance arrives. But Bjorn had something no Viking leader before him possessed, the ability to establish forward operating bases and actually replace his losses in the field. Picture this. Bjorn's fleet sails through the Strait of Gibraltar in the spring of 859 with 60 ships. By medieval standards, this was already a massive force. But here's where it gets interesting. When local Muslim naval forces sank 15 of his vessels in a fierce battle off the Spanish coast, Bjorn didn't retreat to Scandinavia for replacements. Instead, he captured the port city of Algeciras and immediately established a shipyard using local materials and enslaved craftsmen who had been trained in his revolutionary techniques. Within 2 months, Bjorn had not only replaced his losses, but actually expanded his fleet. The Muslims found themselves fighting an enemy who grew stronger with every battle. This campaign continued for 3 full years, with Bjorn hopscotching across the Mediterranean, building temporary shipyards wherever he could secure a harbour and sufficient timber. His raiders reached as far as North Africa, terrorizing Muslim settlements that had never even heard of the Norse. The strategic implications were revolutionary. Suddenly, Viking expeditions weren't limited by the ships they started with. But the real transformation was happening in the North Atlantic, where Eirik's methods were enabling the largest mass migration in European history since the fall of Rome. In Iceland, A settler named Ingolf Arnason established the first colonial shipyard using clinker lock construction around 874. Now, you have to understand that Iceland wasn't exactly prime real estate, Iceland par. We're talking about a volcanic island where the growing season lasts about 5 minutes, and the sheep outnumber edible plants by substantial margins. But Ingolf understood something that modern economists would recognize instantly. Transportation infrastructure drives population growth. By establishing rapid shipbuilding capacity on the island itself, he created a feedback loop that transformed Iceland from a marginal refuge for political exiles into a thriving society. The numbers tell the story. Archaeological evidence suggests Iceland's population grew from perhaps a few hundred hardy settlers in 870 to over 30,000 by 920. That's a 60-fold increase in 50 years, population growth that would make modern urban planners weep with envy. And it was all made possible by ships. Ships carrying new settlers, ships bringing essential supplies, ships maintaining contact with the outside world. Without Eirik's innovation, Iceland would have remained what it had been for centuries, an empty rock in the North Atlantic. But perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of this new naval power came during the siege of Paris in 885. Count Odo, defending the city for the Frankish Empire, thought he understood Viking tactics. Burn their ships, and you strand them until reinforcements arrive from Scandinavia, a process that typically took months. Odo's forces managed to destroy nearly 40 Viking vessels in a successful fireship attack. The Count probably went to bed that night, feeling pretty good about his chances of holding the city until relief arrived. He woke up to the sound of hammering. The Vikings, led by Sigfrid and Sinrik, had done something unprecedented. They had begun building new assault ships from Frankish forests faster than the defenders could burn them. Using techniques learned from Eirik's workshops, Norse shipwrights were turning French oak into dragon ships literally within sight of Paris's walls. Count Odo watched in growing horror as his tactical victory transformed into strategic nightmare. Every ship he destroyed was replaced within days. Every successful defense was followed by renewed attacks from fresh vessels. The siege, which should have collapsed after the initial ship burning, dragged on for months as the Vikings essentially built a naval shipyard on the Seine River. This wasn't just military innovation, to islay so. It was industrial revolution happening in real time. The human cost of this transformation was staggering. Consider the story of Magnus the Learned, not to be confused with various kings of that name, but a humble boy who began as a wood-gatherer at age 12 in 878. Magnus started by collecting scraps and kindling for the shipyard fires, the kind of job typically reserved for orphans and slaves. But he was bright, observant, and desperately eager to learn. He memorized the names of different wood types, learned to recognize quality timber by sight, and gradually worked his way up through the ranks of shipyard workers. By age 30, Magnus had become a master builder overseeing workshops that employed 300 workers, 300 people whose livelihoods depended on the constant demand for new ships. But here's the thing that would horrify modern environmentalists. Magnus's shipyard was consuming entire forests. The scale of wood consumption during this period was absolutely staggering. A single longship required approximately 20 large oak trees, plus additional timber for internal structures and repairs. Magnus's workshop alone was producing roughly 50 ships per year, which meant they were cutting down 1,000 mature oaks annually. Multiply that across dozens of major shipyards throughout Scandinavia, and you begin to understand why Norse traders were establishing timber networks stretching all the way to the Baltic. Forests that had stood since the time of Christ were disappearing to feed the Viking shipbuilding industry. This environmental pressure drove technological innovation in wood preservation and alternative materials. Shipwrights began experimenting with pine tar treatments that could make lesser woods perform like premium oak. They developed techniques for joining different wood types in single vessels, using the best materials only where absolutely necessary. The cultural fusion happening in places like the Danelaw, the Viking-controlled portions of England, created even more innovation. English shipyards on rivers like the Thames became centres where Norse speed-building techniques merged with Saxon cargo hauling traditions. The result was hybrid vessels that combined the best of both worlds, ships that could still outrun pursuing fleets, but also carry the kind of cargo loads necessary for serious trade operations. These weren't just warships anymore, they were the foundation of a commercial empire. By 900, Viking ships built using clinker-lock methods were carrying Scandinavian amber to Constantinople, bringing Islamic silver to Greenland, and transporting Irish slaves to markets in Baghdad. The speed of construction meant that trade routes could be established and maintained even when individual ships were lost to storms or pirates. But perhaps the most telling measure of this revolution's success was its very ordinariness by the end of the period. What had seemed impossible in Eirik's desperate winter workshop had become routine across the Norse world. A young shipwright in 920 could complete hull assembly in less time than it had taken his grandfather to select and season the timber. Techniques that had been guarded as deadly secrets 50 years earlier were now taught to apprentices as basic skills. The revolution was complete. The empire of wood and wave stretched from Greenland to the Black Sea, powered by ships that rose from coastal workshops like crops from well-tended fields. And at the center of it all, the ghost of a dropped tool and one desperate winter night when everything changed. By 920 after Christ, Eirik Treeshaper's revolutionary shipbuilding technique faced its ultimate test. Could it survive the end of the world that created it? The Viking age was waning. Christian kingdoms were consolidating power, developing standing armies, and building stone fortifications that could withstand the kind of hit-and-run raids that had terrorized Europe for 2 centuries. The Norse themselves were changing, settling down, adopting Christianity, and transforming from raiders into traders and farmers. But perhaps the greatest threat to Eirik's legacy came from an unexpected source, the success itself. When everyone possesses a revolutionary advantage, it stops being revolutionary. By 920, clinker-lock shipbuilding had spread far beyond Scandinavia. Frankish spies had finally cracked the secret, not through clever infiltration or dramatic theft, but through the mundane process of recruiting a converted Norse shipwright named Ketil the Turncoat. Ketil had been captured during a raid in 898, spent 15 years as a slave in Frankish shipyards, converted to Christianity, and eventually earned his freedom by teaching his masters the techniques that had once given his people such devastating advantage. By 925, Frankish fleets built using Norse methods were patrolling the very waters that Viking raiders had once considered their private highways. What followed was an arms race that would reshape European naval power for centuries. Norse shipwrights, suddenly facing enemies who could build ships as fast as they could, were forced to innovate or become irrelevant. Enter the next generation of revolutionary techniques, OCDIS. Copper-reinforced joints that could withstand ramming attacks, flexible mast systems that survived storms that shattered traditional rigging, and early experiments with sealed bulkheads that could keep ships afloat even when hulled below the waterline. But innovation requires institutional memory, and institutional memory requires preservation. This is where we encounter one of the most remarkable figures of the late Viking Age, Master Builder. Sigrid remembered Hans. Sigrid earned her unusual name from an almost supernatural ability to recall construction techniques by touch alone. She could run her fingers along a ship's hull and tell you not just how it was built, but who had built it and what regional variations they had employed. In a world where knowledge was still transmitted primarily through hands-on apprenticeship, Sigrid represented a living library of maritime expertise. Around 980, Sigrid established the first formal shipwright school in Roskilde, Denmark. This wasn't just a workshop where apprentices learned by watching masters work. It was a systematic attempt to codify 3 centuries of accumulated knowledge into teachable methods. Think about what this meant. For the first time since Eirik's desperate winter, shipbuilding knowledge was being preserved in organized, transferable form. Sigrid's students learned not just how to cut clinker-lock joints, but why those angles worked, when to use alternatives, and how to adapt techniques for different wood types and vessel purposes. These students spread across Europe like missionaries of maritime technology. They carried not just the technical knowledge of advanced shipbuilding, but the cultural values embedded within it. The Norse emphasis on functionality over ornamentation, the understanding that ships were tools for reaching new horizons rather than symbols of static power. But all technological revolutions eventually face their obsolescence moment, and for Viking shipbuilding, that moment came on September 25, 1066, at a place called Stamford Bridge. Harald Hardrada, Harald Hard Ruler, the last of the great Viking kings, had assembled what would prove to be the final classical Norse invasion fleet. 300 ships built using techniques that traced their lineage directly back to Eirik Treeshaper's innovation. These vessels had been constructed in just 4 months, a pace that would have been impossible without clinker lock methods. But Harald's fleet, for all its technical superiority, couldn't overcome the fundamental strategic shift that was reshaping European warfare. King Harold Godwinson of England didn't try to match the Vikings ship for ship. Instead, he used forced marches and land-based cavalry to reach Stamford Bridge before Harold could properly deploy his naval advantage. The battle that followed was brutal and decisive. Harald Hardrada died with an arrow in his throat, and his surviving followers sailed home in just 24 ships, enough to carry the remnants of an army that had arrived with thousands. The age of Viking expansion was over, but the technology that had powered it was just beginning its next chapter. Here's where our story takes a remarkable leap forward, from the medieval world to the modern age of archaeology. In 1962, exactly 9 centuries after Eirik's revolutionary winter, Danish archaeologists made an extraordinary discovery in Roskilde Fjord. 5 ships, deliberately sunk to block a harbour entrance sometime around 10th century, had been preserved in the cold, oxygen-poor water. When marine archaeologists raised these vessels and began studying their construction, they found themselves looking at the evolutionary endpoint of Eirik's innovation. The Skuldelev ships, named for the barrier where they were found, revealed construction techniques that were simultaneously ancient and startlingly advanced. The characteristic angled joints of clinker lock assembly were clearly visible, but they had been refined through centuries of development into forms that modern naval architects found genuinely impressive. Dr. Ole Crumlin Pedersen, the marine archaeologist who led the Skuldelev excavation, described the experience of examining these medieval vessels as like finding a perfectly preserved Formula One race car in an ancient Roman garage. The level of sophisticated engineering, embedded in what appeared to be simple wooden boats, challenged every assumption about medieval technological capability. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this archaeological discovery was what it revealed about the transmission of knowledge across centuries. Every joint, every reinforcement, every design choice in the Skuldelev ships could be traced back through an unbroken chain of master to apprentice teaching that stretched directly to Eirik Treeshaper's workshop. This brings us to the present day, where master builder Terje Haugen works in a workshop overlooking the Oslo Fjord, constructing replica Viking ships using traditional methods for museums and cultural preservation projects. Terje's hands follow the same motions that Eirik's hands followed 12 centuries ago. The tools have improved, his adzes are made from better steel, his measuring instruments are more precise, but the fundamental techniques remain unchanged. When Terje cuts an angled joint for clinker lock assembly, he's performing a process that has been passed down through nearly 40 generations of shipwrights. In 2019, Terje completed work on the Dragon Harald Fairhair, the largest Viking ship built in modern times. Watching this vessel take shape in his workshop, you can see the ghosts of every innovation that led to its creation: Eirik's desperate improvisation, the secret techniques of the guild builders, the regional variations developed across centuries of refinement. The construction process drew thousands of visitors, many of whom had no particular interest in either maritime history or woodworking. They came because there's something fundamentally compelling about watching human hands transform raw materials into functional art using methods that predate written history. But here's what strikes me as most remarkable about this continuity. It's not just the preservation of technical knowledge that has survived, but the preservation of the values embedded within that knowledge. Modern Viking shipbuilders still prioritize function over form, still believe that a vessel should be capable of handling whatever conditions it might encounter, still understand that ships are tools for reaching new horizons rather than monuments to their builders' egos. When the Dragon Harald Fairhair was launched, An elderly Norwegian shipwright named Erik Andersen, note the name, was among the crowd watching from shore. Erik had learned traditional building techniques from his grandfather, who had learned them from his grandfather in an unbroken chain stretching back through the centuries. As the dragon ship slipped into the water, Erik turned to a younger spectator and said something that perfectly captures the essence of technological legacy. Every ship teaches the next ship. This is how knowledge stays alive. That dropped tool in Eirik Treeshaper's workshop didn't just change shipbuilding techniques, it created a chain of innovation and preservation that continues to this day. The clinker lock joints that once built the fleets that terrorized medieval Europe now build the vessels that help us remember and understand our shared maritime heritage. Somewhere in a workshop overlooking a Nordic fjord, a master craftsman is teaching an apprentice how to cut angled joints that will lock together like puzzle pieces. The hands are different. The world has changed beyond recognition, but the essential knowledge remains. The revolution that began with desperate necessity in the winter of 842 after Christ continues in the patient work of preservation in the 21st century. And every time an adze bites into oak at exactly the right angle, Eirik Treeshaper's ghost smiles, and the Viking Age lives again. Asterisk, the complete historical narrative has been told. 4 chapters, 4,500 words, tracing the arc of innovation from desperate necessity to cultural legacy across 12 centuries of human endeavor. Asterisk. Lever.